The gunman screamed at everyone to get on the floor, his shotgun sweeping across First National Bank's marble lobby. But the homeless man in the corner didn't move, just kept sitting against the wall, unwrapping a paperclip from around a worn notebook he carried, straightening the metal with fingers that moved with surgical precision. I said, "Get down," the robber shouted, pointing the weapon at him, and that's when everyone saw it. The homeless man's eyes weren't vacant or afraid. They were calculating distances, angles, threat assessments, the eyes of someone who had done this before, many times, in places far more dangerous than a suburban bank. His name was John Ghost McKenna, former Delta Force commander, living on the streets for 5 years by choice, hiding from enemies who thought he was dead, and in exactly 4 seconds, he would remind everyone why they used to call him the most dangerous man in special operations. The bank's morning had started normally, Jennifer Walsh opening the doors at 9 sharp, the usual collection of customers filtering in, retirees depositing social security checks, small business owners making change, mothers with strollers navigating the velvet rope queue, and John sitting in his usual spot by the potted plant, the spot with clear sight lines to all 3 exits, the spot where he could watch everyone who entered without seeming to watch at all. He'd been there every morning for 2 years, part of the furniture, invisible the way homeless people become invisible, just another casualty of America's forgotten wars. Except John McKenna had never been forgotten by the people who mattered, the people who knew that Ghost didn't die in that drone strike in Syria. That Ghost had walked away from a burning safe house with 3 bullets in him and intelligence that could destabilize half the Middle East. Intelligence he'd memorized and destroyed because that's what ghosts do. They carry secrets that can't be written down. The 3 robbers had entered at 9:47, professionals by the way they moved, the leader tall and lean with prison tattoos visible above his collar, the second man stocky with the nervous energy of someone high on adrenaline or something stronger, the third hanging back by the door, the smart one, the one watching for problems, except he was watching the wrong things, watching for security guards and panic buttons, not watching the homeless man who had already identified their weapons, counted their rounds, catalogued their weaknesses, the leader favoring his left knee from an old injury, the nervous one's trigger discipline sloppy from drugs or inexperience, the smart one wearing boots with worn soles that would slip on the marble floor if he had to pivot quickly. Everyone on the ground. This is a robbery. Don't be heroes, and nobody dies. The leader announced with practiced efficiency, and people dropped, screaming, crying, mothers covering children, the elderly struggling to comply. But John just sat there, straightening his paperclip, bending it into shapes that looked random but weren't, each fold creating a tool, a weapon, muscle memory from a training camp in North Carolina where they'd taught him to kill with everything and nothing, where he'd learned that death didn't need bullets, just knowledge of where human bodies were weak, where pressure points clustered, where a thin piece of metal could slip between vertebrae or find the subclavian artery if you knew the angle, if you'd practiced 10,000 times, until your hands moved without conscious thought. Jennifer Walsh was on her knees behind her desk, reaching for the silent alarm when she saw John stand up, not quickly, not aggressively, just unfolding from his seated position with the careful movements of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt too many times. And she wanted to scream at him to get down. This crazy homeless veteran was going to get himself killed. But something in his posture made her pause. The way he rolled his shoulders, the way his feet positioned themselves automatically in a combat stance that looked like casual standing unless you knew what to look for. The nervous robber noticed him first, swinging his pistol around. "Old man," I said, "get down, you deaf or stupid." And John smiled. Not the smile of a sane person, but the smile Delta operators got right before an operation went loud. The smile that meant someone had made a tactical error and didn't know it yet. The smile Ghost had worn in Fallujah when he'd cleared a building with nothing but a knife because his rifle had jammed. The smile that haunted the dreams of the few enemies who'd survived seeing it. "I'm both," John said, his voice rusty from disuse but carrying an authority that made everyone in the bank freeze, even the robbers. Because there was something wrong here. Something that didn't fit. This wasn't how homeless people acted. This wasn't fear or mental illness. This was something else. Something that triggered primitive warnings in the reptilian parts of their brains that recognized an apex predator, even when it was dressed in Salvation Army cast-offs and hadn't showered in weeks. The leader stepped forward, shotgun raised, trying to regain control of a situation that had suddenly shifted in ways he didn't understand. "You got a death wish, bum." And John held up the paperclip, now shaped into something that looked almost like a key but wasn't. Something with precise angles and a pointed end that caught the light. No, but you do, you just don't know it yet. See, I've been watching you. For 18 minutes, I know you've got 12 shells in that Remington 870. 5 rounds in your partner's Glock 19 with 1 in the chamber, and your friend by the door has a Smith & Wesson that he's never fired because the oil pattern on the grip is still factory fresh. I know you did time in Chino because of how you hold your weapon, prison yard style, protecting your center mass. And I know your partner there is approximately 40 minutes from peak methamphetamine toxicity based on his pupil dilation and the frequency of his blinking, which means in about 10 minutes he's going to start getting paranoid, twitchy, likely to fire on accident, and that's going to cause a problem for everyone here. The bank had gone completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and someone's quiet sobbing, and the leader was trying to process what he'd just heard, trying to understand how a homeless man could know these things, could speak with the clinical precision of someone trained in threat assessment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down, couldn't let him be faced down by some street crazy with a paperclip. So he made the mistake that would cost him everything. He took 3 steps forward, close enough that the barrel of his shotgun was inches from John's chest, close enough that John could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath, close enough that killing him would be easy, except proximity was exactly what Ghost wanted, what he'd been trained for, what he'd excelled at in places where gunfire would bring unwanted attention, where silence was survival. John moved the way water moves around rocks, fluid and inevitable, his left hand sweeping the shotgun barrel up and away while his right hand drove the paperclip through the soft tissue just below the leader's ear, finding the nerve cluster that shut down motor control, and the big man dropped like his strings had been cut, the shotgun clattering across marble as John was already moving, using the leader's falling body as cover while he closed on the nervous one whose drug-addled reflexes were just starting to process that something had happened, that his partner was down, that the homeless man was coming toward him with terrible purpose. The paperclip had been reformed in the half-second of movement, wrapped around John's middle finger now with the point extending like a claw, and he hit the nervous robber in the solar plexus first, driving air from lungs, then swept his legs, while driving the metal point into the pressure point behind the knee that neurologists called the common fibular nerve but Delta called the off switch, and the man screamed once before his nervous system overloaded and shut down, leaving him twitching on the floor while John rolled behind a pillar as the smart one by the door finally got his weapon up and fired. The sound enormous in the enclosed space, the bullet chipping marble where John had been standing a second before, but John had already processed the acoustics, knew from the sound that the smart one was using hollow points, devastating if they hit but less effective against hardcover, and he'd counted the shooter's breathing pattern, knew he was left-handed, from how he'd positioned himself at the door, knew he'd aim low because that's what untrained shooters do under stress. So John went high, vaulting over the teller counter in a move that should have been impossible for someone his age, except the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and muscle memory doesn't care about sleeping on concrete or eating from dumpsters. It just responds when called upon. The smart robber got 2 more shots off, one shattering a computer monitor in an explosion of sparks, the other punching through the wooden counter as John slid across the floor behind the teller stations, popping up exactly where geometry and probability said the shooter wouldn't expect, the paperclip leaving his hand in a throw that embedded it in the man's right eye, not deep enough to kill but deep enough to cause him to drop his weapon and scream, clutching at his face as John closed the distance and finished him with a chokehold that would have made his instructors at Fort Bragg proud, cutting off blood flow to the brain until the man went limp, unconscious but alive because Ghost didn't kill unless necessary, hadn't killed since Syria, since the day he'd decided to disappear rather than follow orders that would have resulted in the deaths of children. Orders that came from so high up that refusing them meant he could never go home, never be John McKenna again, could only be the ghost of a soldier, haunting the streets of a country that thought he was dead. The entire takedown had lasted 18 seconds, and as John stood in the middle of the bank lobby, 3 armed robbers unconscious around him, 14 hostages staring in shock, Jennifer Walsh still frozen with her hand over the panic button. She'd never had time to push. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that comes after combat, when your ears are ringing and your adrenaline is crashing and you're trying to remember how to be human again instead of weapon. Someone should probably call the police, John said quietly, already moving toward the door, knowing he had minutes at most before law enforcement arrived, before questions started that he couldn't answer, before someone ran his fingerprints, and discovered that John McKenna had died 5 years ago in a drone strike that had been meant for him, ordered by people who'd decided he knew too much about operations that Congress had never approved, about money that had disappeared into black sites and private military contractors' accounts, about decisions that had cost American lives to protect Saudi interests. But Jennifer Walsh found her voice. "Wait, don't go. You saved us. You're a hero." And John paused at the door, looking back at her with eyes that had seen too much. "No, ma'am, I'm nobody. Just a homeless vet who got lucky. And if anyone asks, that's all you saw, someone who got lucky, because if you tell them anything else, if you describe what really happened here, people are going to come looking, and those people don't leave witnesses, even 14 years later, even in suburban banks, they clean up loose ends, always have, always will." He was halfway through the door when one of the hostages, an elderly man wearing a Marine Corps pin on his lapel, stood up and called out, "I know who you are. I remember you from Kandahar. You're Ghost. You saved my son's unit, pulled them out of an ambush when command said it was too hot to extract." And John stopped, turned slightly. "Your son. Was he the kid from Texas? The one who kept photos of his daughter in his helmet?" The old Marine nodded, tears streaming down his face. "He made it home because of you. Has 3 kids now. Tells them about the ghost who walked through fire to save his team." And John smiled, a real smile this time, not the predator's grin from combat, but something human, something that remembered why he'd joined Delta in the first place, before the politics and the black ops and the moral compromises that had hollowed him out until only the ghost remained. The sirens were getting closer, and John knew he had to go, had to disappear back into the invisible population of America's homeless where nobody looked too closely, where a decorated soldier could hide in plain sight because people would rather look away than confront the shame of how the country treats its veterans. But before he left, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a challenge coin, worn smooth from years of handling, and tossed it to the Marine. "Tell your son Ghost is still on watch, always will be." And then he was gone, slipping out the door, and blending into the morning crowd, just another homeless vet shuffling along the sidewalk, invisible again, safe again, at least until the next time someone needed a ghost to save them. 3 hours later, FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen stood in the bank reviewing security footage that would never be released to the public, watching a homeless man take down 3 armed robbers with techniques that only existed in classified training manuals, techniques she'd only seen once before in heavily redacted files about a Delta Force unit that officially never existed. And she knew exactly who John McKenna was, knew why he'd disappeared, knew that her superiors would want him found and silenced, but she also knew what he'd done before he went rogue, how many lives he'd saved, how many times he'd been the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Her partner, Agent Williams, whistled low as they watched the footage for the 5th time. "That's impossible. No homeless guy moves like that. This has to be someone trained, someone dangerous." And Sarah nodded. "Already making decisions that could end her career. You're right. Definitely trained. Probably military. PTSD maybe made him snap. Got lucky with those takedowns. Adrenaline and muscle memory. Nothing more than that." And she deleted the high-resolution files, leaving only grainy footage that showed shapes and movement, but not the precision, not the techniques that would set off alarms at Langley and the Pentagon. She interviewed the witnesses separately, carefully guiding their statements away from specifics, suggesting trauma might have affected their memories, that things happened so fast they couldn't be sure what they saw, and most were happy to accept that narrative, to believe they'd been saved by luck rather than by one of America's most lethal soldiers who'd been abandoned by his country and chosen to protect it anyway from the shadows. Only Jennifer Walsh pushed back. "That man knew exactly what he was doing. He saved our lives with surgical precision. Why are you trying to minimize what he did?" And Sarah leaned in close, speaking quietly, "Because, ma'am, sometimes heroes need to stay hidden to keep doing heroic things, and sometimes the best thing we can do for them is forget we ever saw them. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Jennifer nodded slowly, remembering John's warning about people who clean up loose ends, and she signed the statement that described a lucky homeless veteran who'd managed to stop a robbery, through fortunate circumstances and the incompetence of the criminals. Meanwhile, John McKenna sat in a new spot 12 blocks away, outside a different bank, watching patterns, noting vulnerabilities, standing watch the way he'd always done, because that's what ghosts do. They protect from the shadows, they serve. Without recognition, they accept that honor isn't about medals or acknowledgement, but about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere, someone is alive because you were there when it mattered. He opened his war notebook, the one he'd carried since Syria, and made a new entry in the code only he could read, documenting the morning's action, analyzing what he could have done better, faster, cleaner, because even ghosts need to stay sharp, need to maintain their edge, especially when they're 63 years old with arthritis and old wounds that ache when it rains. Living on the streets where every day is a survival exercise and every night brings new dangers that have nothing to do with enemy combatants and everything to do with the forgotten war being waged in America's alleys and underpasses. A young police officer approached him, the kind who still believed in helping people. "Sir, you can't sit here," bank management complained, and John stood up slowly, respectfully. "Of course, officer. I'll move along," and he shuffled away, invisible. Again, just another homeless veteran in a country full of them, except this one had a paperclip in his pocket that he was already starting to bend into new shapes, and skills that would never fade, and a commitment to protection that transcended his own betrayal by the system he'd sworn to defend. That night Sarah Chen sat in her apartment, staring at the one file she hadn't deleted, the close-up of John McKenna's face from the bank camera, and she made a decision that would haunt her or save her, she couldn't know which, creating a new entry in the federal database that marked John McKenna as deceased. Confirmed Kia, case closed, no further investigation warranted. Because sometimes the best way to protect a hero is to make sure nobody goes looking for him, to let the ghost remain a ghost, watching from the shadows, ready to act when needed. A guardian angel dressed in cast-off clothes and carrying the weight of secrets that could topple governments, but choosing instead to carry the lighter burden of protecting strangers who would never know his name, never know that one of Delta Force's most decorated soldiers had saved them with nothing but a paperclip and the terrible skills that America had taught him and then tried to bury along with his identity. But ghosts don't stay buried, they just find new places to haunt, new people to protect, new wars to fight in silence and solitude, armed with improvised weapons and unbreakable will, because that's what soldiers do. They soldier on, even when their country